at the Yale University Art Gallery, and I'm joined today by two colleagues from other institutions. Horace Ballard, he's the curator of education at the Birmingham Museum of Art, and before that he worked at RISD, the Yale University Art Gallery, and at Monticello, the historic home of Thomas Jefferson. He is the icon that is the most artsy on the far side. I'm also joined by Susy Bielak, who is the Associate Director of Engagement and Curator of Public Practice at the Block Museum at Northwestern. And she builds and leads the new engagement department at her museum, thinking about programming, education, and partnerships and communications. And today, we three, along with, we may be joined by some other colleagues from NAEA who are helping to moderate this. We're going to be exploring the idea of what a teaching museum is, thinking about case examples and our own work, and then moving on to a deep conversation about the balance between, if you're at a teaching museum at a university, for instance, the balance between working with a community that is outside the university and your built-in university's audience. Or if you're at a municipal museum, the reverse, the public for whom you are most engaged, and then others that you are learning to connect with as well. So those are the two parts of today. We're going to start off with a sort of case study and examples from our own work, and then we're going to open it up to conversation and questions from you. As we go along, please feel free to chime in with questions. We'll be moderating these and adding and addressing them as they come up. In addition, I wanted to remind everybody about the next week is our actual conference, live conference in person, with a pre-conference earlier in the week, which I now hear is sold out. Is that right?
Yes. So, hi, I'm Michelle Growe. I'm the division director-elect. It is sold out, and we don't have a waiting list because of space capacity issues. But we encourage everyone to follow along with our hashtag, which is hashtag NAEA MUSED16. And we'll be live tweeting throughout the day, and we will also use that throughout the annual convention. So we'll be able to connect with one another even if you didn't get a spot in the pre-conference this year. So thank you, and we look forward to seeing peer-to-peer in person next week.
Great, thank you. So let's start off by talking about what it is to actually be a teaching museum. And I think about this right now a lot because the museum I'm in about 15 years ago changed its mission to have a dual mission of collecting and research along with education. And in being a teaching museum, in some ways it's a little bit like a teaching hospital. Students are part of absolutely everything that we do. We have over 100 students working for us in the museum, mentoring under us, and thinking about how the work they do can become future careers, but also just influence the work that they do as students at the university. And in particular, I think about students who work in the education department, which is where I am, and the opportunities that they are offered, but also what that then teaches us. So for us at the museum, all of our teaching is done by students, both undergraduates and graduates, in two different programs, the Gallery Guide program and the Wordle Gallery Teacher program. The teacher program is the graduate students, the guide program is the undergraduates. And these students are learning about audience, they're learning about educational philosophy, they're learning about the collection, and they're also learning about what curatorial decisions are made to put on an exhibition that then is taught from for various audiences, which include the public, the Yale community, K-12 audiences, teachers, special needs audiences, and so forth. In addition, we also work with students who do special curated exhibitions. And these student curated exhibitions are mining our permanent collection and putting on an exhibition in a major exhibition space of the museum. And they're treated as curators. They're mentored by staff. But they usually have some kind of publication that goes with it. They have to think about a variety of things that go into putting an exhibition together. And it's interesting that this ends up, I think, having a deep impact on them. But from the perspective of a teaching museum, we're actually training a next generation of people who will go into careers in museums. And I have to just say that Horace, who's joining us today, is one of these people who worked at the Yale Art Gallery for many years, both as a teacher and then as a student curator, and then went on to other places, and now is working in museum education at a major institution. So for me, this is a very exciting day to be able to think about how all of this works because of something like a teaching institution, teaching museum. Susy, you had an interesting example, too, you wanted to talk about. Maybe we could have you sort of add to this with your example.
Yeah, happily. And maybe to lay the ground before I dive into the case study, just to piggyback on some of what you said, I think that in addition to thinking practically about what does it mean to serve as this role of a teaching and learning museum, to think too philosophically about what it can look like. And before coming to the block, I directed programs at the Walker Art Center, a major contemporary art museum. And we thought a lot there about what I describe as the expanded classroom. So thinking about the spectrum of what teaching and learning can look like, and you gave great examples, but to chime in to say that, you know, when at the Walker, I, along with a number of colleagues, taught university classes, really making use of relational objects, thinking about the span and spectrum of what a multidisciplinary art center could offer, but then also really viewed our exhibitions, publications, and programs as site for the production of knowledge, and thought a lot about that juncture in between artists, the museum, and the public, and how all of those things go together. So the example that I wanted to share comes from a recent visit we had in relationship to a current exhibition. At the block, well, we have a collection. A lot of what we've been focusing on in the last few years have been our exhibitions, which focus for the most part either on shows that come to us or that we originate. And we have one up right now called A Feast of Astonishment, Charlotte Moorman and the Avant-Garde, 1960s through 1980s, that focuses on this extraordinary moment in history that's a precedent and precursor for a lot of what we see in artistic practice today. And in terms of the arc of programming, we were really intent to bring living artists who are both key figures of the avant-garde, but also are shining lights now for artistic practice. And one of those artists was Simone Forti, who is known perhaps most for her work as a postmodern choreographer. She made famous translating quotidian movements into performance and actions. And this case to me was so interesting because it was a moment of collaboration. When we approached Simone, we asked her to set huddle, which is just what it sounds like, a bunch of people coming together and forming a huddle with their bodies and climbing on top of each other, making a mountain for each other and climbing over it. And when we got Simone on the phone, she said, you know, maybe, but what I'm really interested in doing is in doing something that is intellectually inspiring, that's curious. And over a series of conversations, we developed a project that would bring her to campus to develop a workshop that would bleed between writing and movement, that would respond to the environment and this extraordinary lake that we butt up right next to, and perception. So using her primary teaching method and artistic method, which is improvisation, and it was extremely transformative. What we did is we brought together kind of traditional teaching. So Simone visited classrooms. She, for example, visited a postmodern dance class, but we brought together a group of 18 students from an undergrad in math to PhD candidates in performance studies and art history for 8 hours of workshops, which to ask from Northwestern students is actually a really tall order. And through that time together, we fostered a kind of community. The resulting public program consisted of a postdoc who was a key partner in building the residency, interviewing Simone, so hearing from her about her practice, and then students performing both writings that they'd written through these workshops, as well as staging 2 sets of huddle. And it was something that was really striking. One other layer that I'll add to it is that all of this was part of a citywide performing arts festival called In Time. That's a triennial performing arts festival. So a lot of what we try to do is think about what are the layers that we can weave in between working with different levels of students, between thinking about different modalities of teaching and learning, and connecting to our community. And that can range from thinking about when the subject at hand calls for something that's more in the vein of a town hall, or calls for connecting to the local artistic community. How can we best do that? So we were able to flex a lot of those muscles in this case.
Horace, would you like to also share your example of this? I mean, you've gone from teaching museums that are university museums to a municipal museum that's now a museum that's also focused on teaching. And yesterday, when you and I were talking, you were sharing some interesting examples and also the history of your institution that brings you to what is happening there today.
Yes, thank you, Jessica. The Birmingham Museum of Art was founded in 1957. So as a large municipal museum, it comes a little late to the game, and as we think about kind of museums in Boston, New York, but with the same focus. However, as we know, the 50s and early 60s in Birmingham were incredibly racially and socioeconomically contentious. And so the education department has its start date in 1963, and as I was telling Jessica yesterday, was the first entity at the museum that was integrated. And it was started specifically to integrate the programs of art history and art education and museum education in the region. And when we think about our region, before kind of the High Museum began its recent collections, we thought of ourselves as being the museum in the Southeast, from Raleigh to New Orleans. And one of the things that I brought back was our famous studio school. So in 1963, at the height of the civil rights movement and the Birmingham and Montgomery bus boycott, the Museum Education Center was started as its own 501c3 and remained that way into '96. And we see 1,500 K through 12 tours a year, over 50,000 students a year from Birmingham and Atlanta, New Orleans, Mississippi, and North Central Georgia. And the studio school is our real beating heart of the education department. It is where we think about STEM to STEAM, most notably, and how artists are trained. And having recently come from the Rhode Island School of Design, and of course, being at the Yale Art Gallery, the training of young artists, the history that they need, the expertise in science and mathematics and physiognomy, as well as philosophy, as well as history, to inform their own interpretation and their own culling and reduction of a canon for their own work, is really what I'm thinking a lot about as we think about what we can learn from a core audience that I would consider the region that Birmingham is in, the Deep South, and what we can best take from, say, specific partnerships and collaborations that then help us to return worth and value and understanding around the questioning and inquiry that comes from making.
Thank you. I'm intrigued. I think it's so interesting to be thinking about also the different histories that our institutions represent, and what this means for both the audience that comes to us, but also how we develop our own programming, our own communication with our public. And Horace, coming from university museums to a municipal museum, are you finding a very strong built-in audience, or are you finding that you're developing brand new audiences because you're coming with both this university background and now this strong municipal side?
That is a wonderful question, Jessica. We have a very strong and very large and very dedicated municipal audience at the museum, but it is not very diverse, and it does not look the way, and many of us can understand for those reasons, it doesn't look the way that you would expect an audience in a city that's 82% African American to look. And so I would say, of our great docent corps, which are over 100, and of some of our greatest docents and many of the individuals on our boards and on our commissions, which are largely city appointed because we are a city funded museum, most of them come from about 3 zip codes in one of the highest grossing areas of the country, Mountain Brook, Alabama. Beautiful and wonderful, but one of the things that I was tasked with by being the first curator ever at the Birmingham Museum of Art who would identify as an American of African descent is to think about that diversity explicitly. And one of the ways that I have just now, after 6 months, kind of gotten my feet under my ground is to have a lot of one-on-one conversations with colleagues at the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, at the McWane Science Center, at the wonderful area colleges and universities, because we know that there is a built-in audience and things have been happening piecemeal. This curator knows this professor who brings a couple of students. You know, someone has a great experience at a K through 12 school and wants to bring that teacher who then continues to bring over the years. But to extend a consistent welcome invitation to the community through core programming and a few other kind of weekend off hours festivals to really say we are here for you. We are here for you, and that, as we all know, is an ongoing work, particularly when one is just beginning to think about its mission as a teaching museum.
Thank you. And I'm intrigued also, Susy, this applies a bit to you as well. We are all institutions that are one of many in our communities. We're not the only ones there, each with slightly different missions and sometimes overlapping missions. And how as a teaching museum, does that role change either our perception in the community or our responsibility in the various communities with whom we work?
That's a great question. I mean, first of all, Horace, I just want to say that I'm really glad to be hearing of the work that you're doing, and to say that the coming to the block, and in a way going in a different direction from a major museum that was at a juncture of really thinking about its relationship with the public and serving as a civic institution, and being brought on board to develop a brand new department of engagement and think very much about bringing that philosophy and sensibility to a private university that also is very interested in connecting to communities. There are a lot of questions at hand that include things that range from how do we best foster alliances and partnerships with other cultural institutions, how to, in a way, make good on the questions embedded within a mission that seeks to serve as a teaching and learning resource, but also wants to be a bridge to communities. There are a lot of challenges, as well as opportunities built into that. What I'd say is, as a teaching and learning institution, in a way, I feel that both pleasure, opportunity, and obligation is to think about breadth and depth of what we do. That being situated in the heart of a site of critical inquiry, that we are charged to do the very same thing, and that applies both to ways that we think about audience, how we build the work that we do from the ground up, thinking about who we're partnering with. We've developed through lines that we use to chart out every aspect of our program, from exhibitions to each program that we do, that in most cases the work is built through a combination of discourse both with stakeholders on campus, primarily faculty, also students, and staff and other colleagues around the university, but then also folks in the community that, again, range from, depending on what the issue is at hand, to colleagues in other institutions, to members of the local Evanston community. So it's right now we're actually in the act, my department is about to embark on a moment of strategic planning, and part of what we're thinking about is our point of difference. But the shortest way I'd put it is that by being situated in this context, we don't have a door count, for example. We don't need to have a certain number of people who come in and out of the institution. We are mission driven to the core. And because we have these multiple emphases on really using art as a springboard for thinking of issues of relevance to our time and across time and geographies, and are also invested in being of relevance to where we are, we hold those things together and simultaneously in a way that probably many organizations would. All of our mission statements tend to have similar language, but I can say that part of what we internally at the block think about very closely is how can we do it, and how can we do it ethically, and how can we do it really holistically, which is some of what I was hearing, Horace, and what you were talking about.
Thank you so much for that. Thank you. I adore the block, and every time I go to Chicago, I go up and I see it, and I'm thrilled by your appointment, and I'm thrilled to hear about these initiatives, particularly with Forti. That is awesome. And you know, if I could piggyback briefly to say, it's interesting, we too have just started, I was telling Jessica yesterday, a strategic planning initiative to prepare us for a possible expansion within the next 7 to 10 years, and to think about, you know, 50, 60 years after the civil rights moment, but knowing that that moment had a long precursor, not just in the Deep South and in the North, but in the Americas, and also knowing that those same precepts are still being fought as we think about gender, right? As we think about sexuality, as we think about socioeconomic status. And one of the difficult things, and Jessica, having been a wonderful mentor and teacher and colleague for so many years, knows that my training in 19th century art is all about making racial gender lines go away, about complexifying those very social categories. And so even while the Birmingham Museum of Art is free, we still feel the need to count the number of people in the door, and we still feel the need to look around to say, are we diverse? And it is one of the great but really difficult processes. I can feel myself getting on my high horse and also taking myself off the high horse by thinking about, we are counting phenotypical difference, and that looks different to all of us who are in the room. How can we count it? And yet it's important to count. And so those tensions between breadth and depth, offering a little something, a little slice, and yet keeping the ethical foundations, making sure that the mission is clear and constantly being engaged with, and then making sure that there are enough what we call hooks at the museum, enough kind of intellectual, cultural hooks, everything from language to, hey, Kerry James Marshall is one of our favorite sons of Birmingham, and look at his work, he's thinking about this. You can also see it in the medieval galleries. He's also thinking about Buddhist art. You know, of trying to make those connections every way we can for as wide of an audience as we can, while also dealing with the 21st century aspects of who we are as scholars and people, is a tension that I would say 99% of the time is incredibly fruitful. And the 1% that it's not is where the questioning, I think, really comes in.
I think this is such an interesting moment, Horace, that you're describing to us. Also, I'm thinking back to conversations the three of us have had in sort of separate sections about the idea of time and how there's a time in the history of our own institutions, but also the time of looking, the time spent really being able to delve deeply into something. And something that came to mind yesterday, Horace, when we were talking, was this idea that for the new visitor, regardless of their, regardless of who they are, if they are new to the museum, looking at art, the culture of looking at art, time is something that needs to be offered to them and be part of what they are given from the institution. This is also for students who are first learning how to work in a museum. The luxury of time as a way to gain comfort and knowledge is something, Horace, that you were speaking about yesterday that I thought would be an interesting segue before we get into some more case examples of different kinds of audiences.
I love that, and you're so right, and I thought a little bit more on it. Susy, and for our audience, you know, Jessica and I were talking about, for me, having been fortunate enough to really hone my training at the Yale Art Gallery, and then while I was a doctoral student at Brown to work at RISD, I never questioned that the learning of a collection and the teaching that took place out of that learning and out of that engagement was centered around questions, was centered around a preferencing not of an object, not of the visitor, but the object and visitor looking and talking to each other. And all of that necessitated a specific facilitated time and space. And I think one of the things that quickly changes, Jessica and I were saying, particularly for me, going directly from being a student to being now a head of a department, was that I felt that time just went out the door. Yeah. That now I was talking to development and communications and my curatorial colleagues and senior staff and the press, all about what are you going to do? What are you going to do? And I was like, I need to learn the collections. That takes 2 years, 3 years, you know? And so I think you're right, Jessica, to remind ourselves of, I often make these T-charts and to-do lists and to say, okay, today we have 20 tours and we have these studio classes and I have these deadlines for development and communications and I have my own kind of running checklist of budget things that I want to keep in terms with, and these 3 living artists that I want to talk to. Okay. When have I taken time to just walk myself through the galleries, not through the basement, not cutting across, not through the security lot, but walk through the galleries, see who's looking, look at a collection that I love, and find an object that I don't yet know about that I can ask my collection curatorial colleagues about. And then, when I'm teaching, to luxuriate in the 2 minutes that we sit in silence and we look together, to allow some of those training that I gathered at the great teaching institutions that I came from, to model them in my own practice, and to give that gift to others. So even if I'm frenetic, that moment that we have with the object is very still as we can make it.
Thank you. I think this is a perfect segue into the discussion about these audiences. I mean, you've got these audiences who've never been in a museum before who are now being given this opportunity, well, being encouraged to sit first, as you're describing, Horace, in silence before having any kind of conversation, and that deep looking, or that time, is part of the experience itself. I wonder, let me sort of just preface this next part by saying that if anyone out there has any questions, to please type them in on the Q&A on your sidebar. There should be a space for you to write questions. If there are any, we're happy to integrate them into what we're talking about. But for this next portion, I would love for us to think a little bit more about how do we balance our different audiences in our museums, and what does it mean to seek out specific audiences? What does this balancing act allow us to do, prevent us doing? And maybe we should start with some examples. Again, Susy, did you want to go first this time?
Sure, I'm happy to. In a way, I feel like I'm going to do some expanding and contracting, in that the example that Jessica and I had discussed comes from a suite of programs that we developed here in relationship to an exhibition. And what I wanted to raise was the work that those of us in this field do when we, as generalists, kind of go between really divergent subjects, and in each case, you know, how to balance a broad audience that we're all fostering to think carefully about the stakeholders who might be engaged in the issues at hand. In the case of the block being situated in the heart of a campus, to think both about the campus and the civic context, and how to do this when the issues at hand are complex ones or gnarly ones. So the example I have comes from an exhibition that we hosted here last spring that revolved around the significant issue of capital punishment. And part of what brought this artist project, which is Julie Green's The Last Supper, and let me make sure I'm getting the full title. So the title of the project is The Last Supper, 600 Plates Illustrating Final Meals of U.S. Death Row Inmates. And for those of you who aren't familiar, this is a life commitment that this artist has made to generate a plate, and now she's at over 600. Each one renders a last meal request from somebody on death row. And so when this project crossed our desks, we immediately thought of colleagues from around the university, but it just so happens that in Northwestern's history, our colleagues at the law school, and specifically the Center for Wrongful Conviction, were really key players in helping to abolish the death penalty in the state of Illinois. In taking on this topic, the first first thing that we did, even before taking on the show, was begin conversation with our colleagues at the law school. And I wanted to bring up this case because for me it also brings up not only the question of for whom, but also by whom. How do we go about doing the work that we do, and how do we foster partnerships to really engage the issues at hand? And for us, it felt critical to be partnering with our colleagues at the law school and also at the School of Journalism, who in their own history, the then Innocence Project and now Justice Project, also played a key role in this work in the state. And so again, over a period of months, we wound up developing a series of programs, stepping back and thinking about what is going on in the broader context of the U.S. and thinking about things like racial bias and how it figures in the school-to-prison pipeline, thinking about different modes of bias. How do people wind up in prison? So before even getting to the most extreme case of capital punishment, how do we think about these issues? Together with our colleagues at the law school, we thought through this. We partnered with colleagues at the two schools that I mentioned, but also the Center for Civic Engagement, as well as departments around campus, and developed a suite of programs for us thinking about various audiences, both the campus and our colleagues around the city, or I should say cities. We're in Evanston and are next to Chicago, and so we chronically think about our audience as rings of a tree. So we start with the campus, then Evanston, then Chicago, then our local, regional, national, and so on. But in terms of how do we engage people and what is a loaded subject matter and afford the space for reflection and perspective that is invited? How do we think about perceptual barriers? How do we take on partners in the local community? We began with the law school and then wound up working with a handful of local nonprofits who are engaging really divergent issues of what is a multi-pronged issue that comes out of the core issue of capital punishment. So to get to some tangibles, we did a host of programs that range from a conversation looking at citizen journalism and social media in relationship to police brutality and racial bias, and wound up having a presentation, but what really did turn into a kind of town hall meeting in our auditorium. We hosted a dinner in situ in the gallery, so if you can imagine being in the middle of a huge empty room with 600 plates and the kind of weight of that, and having people who had participated to our programming, including a number of exonerees. Along with the law school, we were working in close conversation with the exonerees for that program. A number of them presented their own stories, and that was complemented by the perspective of an executive director of a youth advocacy organization who thinks a lot about how does that school to prison pipeline work, and what can we do? And one of the most striking things out of this work was having members of the public, come up to us and being able to play matchmaker and connect people who are activists and advocates, and connect them directly to members of the public who are interested in taking a stand. This, I should acknowledge, is kind of shifting heavily to the social justice thread that courses through the museum's through lines. But I should say that part of what we were concerned with was trying to strike a kind of balance so that we didn't fall too specifically in terms of one kind of politic or perspective, but again could be a home and host for fostering conversation between and amongst our students, our faculty, and members of our public.
Nice. And I think it's such an interesting example because you're also then potentially even bringing back to your permanent collection with these images of the Last Supper.
Exactly.
And I was also struck when you were talking about this, about the way that you're really bringing together such a diverse level of faculty and also community engagement. At our museum, we're doing a lot of, how do I describe this? I like to think of the question about our community as something that everybody is thinking about in the museum, especially those in our programs department, our education department, the communications department. Really thinking about who it is that's coming to the museum, who else we want to include in the museum, who's not aware of us for whatever reason, given a variety of possibilities, and then who do our students who are doing all this teaching then get to know? So for us, part of the balance we're dealing with. We are a university museum, so we are here for the university, but we're also deeply rooted in a community, a public community, and so that group is part of the 15,000 school children that are coming in, the 20,000 adults, these to various kinds of programs. And one of the things that I've been discovering this year, and I think one of my colleagues, Elizabeth Manikin, who's our assistant curator of education, has been focusing on is how do we help our students become more aware of these publics with whom they're working. Horace, when you and I were talking yesterday, it was interesting to me to realize that we hadn't yet begun doing that kind of awareness when you were a student here. So you were not necessarily aware of the hoped impact we were imagining that we were having students working with students, and that we were working with the Yale community to then work with a public community. It was still in its early stages, but now one of the things we're doing is asking students to actually reflect on what it was like to work with audiences. What did you notice about the group you were working with, in the sense of what did you learn from them, what questions did they have, what could we as an institution be doing better to be thinking about what it is they are hoping to learn when they come. And then also this idea that it's students who are then our face to the public is helping us think about so how do we train these students to do the jobs that need to be done, and what does that mentorship look like within the institution? I've realized over the years that these students who are students are also our colleagues, and we rely on them as such, and there becomes quite a deep connection in the group, and the realization that they are a crucial part of what we do. We rely on them to work with our alumni, they work with our general public, and they do some of our larger collaborations, including when we have conferences, and also more recently we hosted a community breakfast for another department at Yale called the Office of New Haven and State Affairs, who hosts its own breakfast, and they all came together and we were able to explore the entire collection in smaller groups, thinking about just the museum itself and things that relate to their lives outside of the institution. But Horace, I really want to know from you, because here, Susy and I, we imagine programs, we put things together. You've lived through these. What was it like? What is it like to be a member of the university's community working with the public? And in particular, I'm thinking about your role as a teacher in these institutions, but also as a curator, because you were part of a very special program that actually got to curate a traveling exhibition.
I wish you guys could see my face. I've just been like nodding like I'm at a rock concert for the past 15 minutes and just taking notes. This is so fruitful, and I want to thank Jessica and Susy, but of course the EA for having me. My time as a student was incredibly engaging, and I was at the divinity school when I was at Yale, and so the idea of having a conversation or having a moment that had a much wider kind of, as Susy, as you gave us, those three kind of concentric circles, those kind of rings of a tree, just made a lot of cosmological, theological sense, and so then to flip it to real world engagement, I'm thrilled, and in some ways I'm actually thrilled that my time at Yale was incredibly wonderful and rich, and then right after I left was kind of a larger onboarding and scaffolding of some of those same kinds of thoughts, those same kinds of how are you taking what you learn, how are you thinking about language and invitation, how are you thinking about what happens next, how do we assess and evaluate programs in all the ways, quantitative and qualitative ways. And I feel like the conversations I had, particularly transitioning in my third and last year at Yale from being a gallery teacher to being a curatorial intern and working on the embodied show and thinking about its purpose, but even how does one lay out an exhibition so that one is truthful and that the audience who comes, say, for a Sunday Stories in Art, and the art history large survey before they declare their specialties, and your religious colleagues and the scientists who you see at the local bar, on Wednesday night where we're all doing karaoke, do they all feel not only supported, but that you're on message, that you're using the same language, that they feel the same kind of rigor as well as invitation? And I think you both spoke to it. I think at the Birmingham Museum of Art, we actually think about 4 different specific audiences. We think about, this is the first year, which is just interesting that I came here, the kind of spring, summer of 2015 was the first time in Birmingham's history after 50 years that the city did not lose population, but it stayed stagnant and then grew by 1%. And that is because of millennials coming back to this area and thinking about a larger Birmingham Renaissance. So one of the things we think a lot about in our programming is, what are we offering for that college-educated 25 to 40 set who are coming back here to start their families or start their careers? They shouldn't have to give up the things that they had in Atlanta, New Orleans, Chicago, Detroit, New York, etc. They should find it here. Perhaps not on that scale, but those conversations should be active. The second population we think a lot about in our programming are local creatives who left Birmingham and have not returned, to simply let them know. So someone like Carol Walker and her father Larry Walker, who only are right from Atlanta, Carrie James Marshall, Dawood Bey, that we have their work in the collection, that we have been actively following their artistic careers, that we want them to return and to give lectures, hang out, walk around, but see the fruits of their labor in their quote-unquote home turf.
Cool.
The third one is thinking about local colleges and universities. And coming from RISD and Yale, you can imagine my first meetings I set up were with the art and the art history faculty at the University of Alabama at Birmingham, at Miles College, one of our historically black institutions here in the state, and Tuscaloosa and Talladega College. We had up their incredible murals by Hale Woodruff when I came, and so the last kind of month of programming around those murals before they went up to the high. And then also thinking about the University of Alabama and Auburn. What are we doing for those students, both in studio art, art history, and the other majors they have, to say we're open, we're here for you? And then last but not least, what are we doing for the generation of my parents' age and older, and we're only talking people in their mid-50s, early, young, right, baby boomers. What are we doing for that population that still remembers when Negro Day was on Tuesday through the 70s? They are not coming back. And as we know, sadly, and in the Deep South, the statistics are even more daunting than in the East Coast where I'm from or the Northeast. It is that generation that is raising, I would say, the generation, generation XX, XY, that are younger than millennials. That's the generation leading them. So if grandma was never allowed to come to the museum and was working on Tuesdays, so she's never been, K through 12 students are not going to come. It's not a natural place to go. And so we think about 2 things, and I'll quickly think about 2 specific programs. One of the programs we have here that I changed is called Birmingham Speaks. In 2008, because of the election of President Obama, the iPhone was coming out, the iPhone 3GS, all, Serena Williams had won. It was just like this incredible moment for Americans who have always felt or marginally felt as if they had had a hyphenated identity in the Americas. And we instituted a program at that time called BMA Speaks, the Museum of Art Speaks, and it was a spoken word competition. And when I got here, I kind of looked at it, and I had the opportunity to attend one, and I thought, you know, all these poets are wonderful, but now we have the Birmingham Public Library is doing a spoken word, and UAB and Miles College and Jeff State have teamed up around the spoken word, and now we have spoken word in Atlanta. We can't compete with those, and we shouldn't, because it means then if we do it on the same night, we cannot go to those. So we started, we retooled it, and we made it every 3 months. It's called Birmingham Speaks. And I do go on a listening tour to local bars and coffee shops, and I just think about conversations I'm having. And we bring in the politicians, the members of the school board, the people around those directly from the headlines. We give everybody wine. We find a local group to play music as an invocation in the space. And it's a chance, it's a town hall meeting in a very stratified city that brings everyone to city center heart, and we talk. And we have that conversation, and we do not leave. Granted, we have to leave at some time because the guards will kick us out. But we leave enough space so there's always 2 hours of community talking and feedback. And if we sit in silence, we sit in silence, but we never have. And so the last one, we actually had a question of, is Alabama actually holding its promises to the youth of its cities? And from all the 5 municipalities, we had a person in high school speak about their dreams, their ideas, and whether they would ever return to Alabama as a place. And then the next one we're doing, and I'm so proud to say, the curatorial appointment made just before me was of my great colleague in modern contemporary art, Wesson Al-Qadari, who had been in charge and leading a contemporary art museum in Dubai. And she and I had the great fortune of working together on the first ever major contemporary exhibition in the state of Alabama. It will be called Third Space, after Homi Bhabha's The Location of Culture. And thinking about, you come, the art comes, and we both leave changed. And so thinking around the programs of that, there will be 4 rotations, and it's 2 years. And we're bringing in, kind of on the Yale model, we're bringing in for the first time university students from the 5 major universities as student docents, giving them the training, but they craft their own tours to go back out to their communities and to tell us what you need. We're bringing in students from the local Alabama School of the Fine Arts, as well as Phillips Academy, a low achieving but incredibly resource heavy school that was taken over by the city. And really being honest about, we're free, we're open, we're here, and we're willing to meet you. And we need to know and have those tough conversations around race and gender and socioeconomic status that give us the weight enough to feel daunted. We should. The museums shouldn't make us feel happy all the time, but they should allow us to compare, confront ourselves and various cultures with great honesty and empathy. And that's, I think, our big push.
Thank you, Horace. That was beautifully said as well. And I'm struck by, with these things that you're pulling together at your museum, just the range of people involved in participating as well as attending. And I'm wondering what role other departments have in this besides education. And I ask this because as a teaching institution, education doesn't always reside only in an education department, because it's permeating what the entire institution is doing and thinking about. So maybe for both of you, what role do other departments play in this idea of education and teaching as an institutional sort of mandate and philosophy?
Sure. If you don't mind, Susie, just because on tip of my tongue, I'll respond, and I'll be quick. And I thank you for this question, Jessica, as well. The curatorial department is very, very much involved, and I would say, and one of the things that Jessica and I talked about, but it's good to know, and I should have mentioned it early, so forgive me. The museum is interesting. About, I would say, half of the museum staff are city employees. The other half are Museum Foundation private employees. And that actually creates a really interesting and also fruitful tension, particularly in a period of strategic planning. And so I would say half the collection curators are city, and I am as well. And so at the end of the day, when you're going through your list and you can do just one thing, just knowing that city council, right? And so just that little word on our resume and in our title, often we feel makes it apparent. Who did we serve? How did we serve? What did we offer? Was it consistent? And in addition to that, our development is very closely aligned. And so we have both kind of little affinity meetings once a week, but the development officer and I, as well as the communications director, the deputy director, and the head curator, we all have one-on-one meetings every week that are scheduled, that we meet at a coffee shop for lunch or in the museum, and we talk about what's going on. How are you doing? And I would say the other part that is crucial to us is security. And prep and registration, they are angelic and they are wood nymphs. They do work and we don't know how they get it done, and they are kind and generous always. But you know, one of the best pieces of advice I got from the head of prep was make sure you get to know all the security officers, their names, where in the city they live. If they're city side or museum funded side, it's imperative. And they have been a wealth of information because, as we all know, people talk to security officers in the museum, gallery attendants, much more so than they talk to curators or educators on a tour.
That's great. I mean, maybe I'll just piggyback here. I feel like you covered so much. Let me make sure that I'm on. I feel like you covered so much ground, and to share again, telescoping in scale, relatively we're a very small organization, and as you said, Jessica, that engagement education is really written into the bones of what our organization does, and so what that looks like manifests in really different ways, and it ranges from visitor services, fostering a kind of approach, affect, and attitude that is welcoming, that is modeling the kind of practice we want to host in the museum, to there being a newly minted curator of academic programs who sits in the curatorial department. I'll note that in our museum, part of it has to do with scale, but part of it has to do with a restructuring that happened 4 years ago when Lisa Corin, our director, came and did a kind of reshaping of the museum to develop 5 different departments. In my department, as you mentioned in the beginning, at what traditionally falls under the purview of education, but also things that stretch beyond public practice, the kind of curatorial practice that sits between education, engagement, more traditional curatorial practice, sits in my department, as does communications and partnerships. And so a department that often is completely distinct is embedded within what we do, because we see that narrative strategy is so related and integral to what we do in terms of content development. But I can echo a lot of what you said, Horace, and also say that here we think about it in our weekly senior staff meetings. We are so deeply a mission-driven institution and have a kind of transparency that I'm very grateful for. We have weekly all-staff meetings with all of our staff, save for a cadre of our visitor services team, but 2 members of the visitor services team are part of those meetings, and I share back what's cooking in my department, as do other colleagues in our department. We meet regularly with colleagues. We're just now beginning to institute certain meetings that might be taken for granted in larger institutions. Namely, I'm about to implement meetings that are focused specifically on exhibitions, which are an opt-in for members of the curatorial team other than the curator of record, but that also are inviting to the table really anyone who wants to come. And I've just asked my colleagues on the senior team who amongst them would like to participate in these meetings. Similarly, beginning to launch a series of brainstorming meetings where I open the floor to all of my colleagues to bring to the table ideas not only around what we might implement serially, but what's in the air, what's happening in civic discourse on campus, what can we do that's of relevance to the curriculum of colleagues, what might be a special opportunity of a conference, or a kind of artistic practice that's coming to the fore across any discipline. So there is a lot, I'd say, of collaboration and also, again, very different modalities of interpreting what it means to teach and also to learn, so that my colleagues in curatorial host a fellow every year and that fellow curates an exhibition, and that fellow is working on doing research and contributing to the department in that way. And my colleague, who is the curator of academic programs, works closely both with faculty, with classes, and with students to guide them in the nuances and interstices of what it is to produce an exhibition. And I feel like this, in a way, brings us full circle, Jessica, to how we began thinking about that embeddedness of students and faculty in the work that we do across departments.
That was lovely said, Susie. Thank you.
I would agree. And as you're describing the fact that your academic curator is in the curatorial side, in our department, there's been a very strong push to keep the academic curator and the traditional education curators in the same space because we're sort of the same spine, and that we're working with different audiences perhaps, but we're really united in sort of our core beliefs in what we're doing. But that is to also say that we've begun some really great collaborations with curatorial and other departments, thinking about, as exhibitions are coming together, what are the questions faculty are interested in, what are the courses that are being taught that connect deeply to what is in the collection, but also potentially going to be put on view. And one of the really wonderful things I'm discovering is that a lot of the public school curricula, the Yale curricula, and the collection have coming together moments in special exhibitions and in our study gallery, where things are put on semi-permanent view for a semester in ways that we wouldn't have imagined if we were working alone, that we could only find out about if we talked together. And I think because the mission has education as part of it, teaching as part of it, that happens. And it may have happened anyway without that, but I think it really definitely helps to have that there. We have, I don't see any questions, and I see that we are about 2 minutes out. I would just love to thank both of you for participating today, and Michelle and Mari for helping host this. I know that we as a group came up with some follow-up topics, so if this is of interest to anybody, to let us know, and we have a part 2 that we would love to do if it's of interest to the world out there. Definitely. So thank you so much for joining us.
And thank you all. It's
Jessica.
been a pleasure.
Certainly.
Yes, indeed.